Welcome to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. Today is Friday, and boy, do we have some philosophical things to discuss in today's show. It's been quite a week here in the poker universe, in the online arena anyway. All the discussions about
the World Series of
alleged
Poker and how we're gonna talk.
Yeah, all the alleged real-time assistants cheating, all the scandals that have broke in this past week have given rise to the idea of a poker blacklist, right? And today Duncan and I are going to talk about what does that mean, our opinions on said blacklist, the best way to deal with RTA, and I guess what RTA is, and this may be a multi-part topic because it's quite large, quite nuanced, and I get the feeling that Duncan and I are going to have some different opinions, which will be nice for a change. We can disagree with one another over the course of this next hour. Duncan, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well, Brad. Very well. And how about yourself?
I'm doing quite well. Just hanging out, trying to digest all of these bombshells that have been just dropped over this past week.
Yeah. Are you surprised?
No.
We have quite a history. That's true. Like it's for as long as I remember being involved with poker, there's always something popping up.
I agree. I'm anytime there's large incentives to cheat, large financial incentives, there's going to be some percentage of the poker population that will do so. And especially when there's like very minimal downside to cheating, right? Which I think is pretty much the issue at large.
And that was actually going to be my first question. Why do people break the rules? Why do they get to that point? And I think you answered it pretty eloquently, right? I mean, because they can, because they have financial incentive, and well, typically,
I do want to add something here too, like, and I would go back to the steroid era of baseball, where, why did Barry Bonds break the rules during the steroid era? Because he did it actually quite late in the game, or it appeared to be quite late, after Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire had their, just well-publicized chase to own the home run record, right? And beat 61 home runs in a season. And it was clear, right? Like Mark McGwire's arms were like bigger than my head, right? His forearms. He's just a jacked giant guy. And so like when I think about that situation, I think about Barry Bonds and what he was seeing, right? It's very likely, I can't prove this, but he saw two players who he felt were likely inferior hitters than him, who are chasing something that should not be possible and would not have been possible had they not been juicing. And it led to him juicing, right? To basically gain a competitive edge. And then to me, that's like the top of the hierarchy. And then if you go all the way down to the bottom, right, the people who are most at risk are fringe players, like fringe Major League Baseball players whose livelihood and lives depend on staying in the game or making it to the pro level, and they can't unless they start juicing, right? Which just leads to a whole culture of players who are juicing, especially when there was very limited downside to doing so, right? Like I think the penalty was somewhat minor. The testing was pretty much non-existent. It was like an open secret that everybody at the time was juicing, both batters and players. And so the reason why players started cheating was to gain an edge. And then the reason why it became so pervasive was so that all the other players could bridge the gap that was created by steroids, which just led to an infestation across the board, right? Until there were better deterrents in place that reduce the incentive.
This is great. And immediately there are a couple of questions that come to mind. The first question is, how's that different than just being, let's say, genetically different than an opponent, right? So for example, and I mean it philosophically, I don't mean it
Sure.
Practically, it's artificial versus natural. And second of all, where do we draw the line? In other words, isn't there already a hierarchy in baseball and in other sport where you said it yourself, there's already somebody who's ahead of the competition no matter what. And again, how's that different, and where do we draw the line?
Can you restate the question again, just
Yeah,
one more time?
so just to give it a little bit more color, because it's a little bit of a weird question, is when let's say that we have let's say Alex and Bobby, right? I mean, we have two competitors, right? And for whatever reason, at some point before steroids, Alex is ahead of the game. Alex is beating Bobby. So there is something that either Alex does better or she's inherently better. That happens sometimes, right? I mean, not everybody's created equal in every
Sure.
domain of life, right? So at that point, Alex has an edge. And Bobby either does something or is someone or discovers something about themselves, or, they do steroids. And at some point, Bobby, becomes better than Alex for whatever reason. That reason could be, he started studying or he does steroids. My question is, how's that different? All of a sudden Bobby became better. And where do we draw the line? Where would we decide what stuff is allowed and what stuff isn't allowed when we live in a world where hierarchies are going to exist, and the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, they're always going to face the consequences no matter what?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a tough question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's very, very tough to see where the line is. And I mean, I would personally leave it up to the experts in charge to draw the line and make the rules unambiguous
Mm-hmm.
and state them very clearly. And I don't think it's a thing that like retroactively you can retroactively police. I think it
Mm-hmm.
needs to be like quite clear on a giant billboard that everybody is aware of. This is the penalty. Like this is the line, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, we could also make tons of arguments about just where you're born, who your parents are, what your
Mm-hmm.
nutrition plan is,
Absolutely.
how you were trained, how you're raised, access to
Absolutely.
coaches. All of these things inherently give you an edge in the endeavor that you choose to take. And I mean, to me, knowing that like, yeah, it's okay to have a coach, right? It's okay to have a
Mm-hmm.
nutritionist. It's not okay to inject steroids into your body because it's dangerous for your health, that, X, Y, or Z. Dangerous, like a dangerous precedent to set for like teenagers, for instance, who may go down that path and it may be quite unhealthy for them. And so, yeah, and basically make the rules, broadcast them quite clearly and succinctly, and say, this is the punishment. If you get caught doing this thing, this is what will happen.
Here's a crazy and potentially terrible idea worth exploring, right? I mean, that I never hear people talking about it. I mean, but here we have a philosophical podcast. We might as well think about it. What if there is no line? What if everything goes? What if, steroids became legal? I mean, obviously there are going to be negative consequences, and then people are going to have to decide whether they want to do it or not. But what if we allowed that? What is sort of be like the worst that can happen, and isn't in the end of the day up to the person who is going to compete whether or not they're going to do that. And for example, an example that comes to mind is competitive bodybuilding. In competitive bodybuilding, actually, steroids are not only allowed, but they're also encouraged. And I'm not saying to people, you know what, go ahead and do it. I'm actually quite against them, and we can talk about for a very long time. But in terms of regulation, why not let it be? And whoever wants to get into that insanely competitive world, if they want to make those sacrifices, it's still their choice.
Yeah, I think the major thing would be the image, or the image of the professional sports league itself, because you have children who are 5 years old who get into professional baseball, and the players are looked upon as some kind of societal heroes because they're able to play a game at a high level, and they would like to discourage, or actually I don't think they care about discouraging youths from using steroids. I think actually they just care about the negative blowback from the families. I mean, if there's anything that I've learned over the past few years, it's that professional sports leagues by and large don't appear to really care about their players. They more care about the image of their brand and how that is affected. And so I would think that like basically, that's the reason why they don't want steroids to be there. And I would say like I agree with you actually, in that like if the rules were anything goes, then that's the rules, right? Like that's how they govern their own sport, in the same way that like bodybuilding goes, right? I think the major benefit to the anything goes is that at least in that case, you wouldn't have to be dealing with like some sketchy type of operation, or sketchy operation in that like you got to deal with some doctor who's getting these steroids in some way, then administering them, and you don't even know like if everything is good or if you're taking the recommended dose or you're injecting it correctly. I mean, like, so basically there would be more oversight into the whole process, which I think would be overall healthier to the players, and be definitely more educational. So like, to me, I think that it's not a bad idea to just say anything goes in that sense. If there's some kind of oversight, maybe within X limit or whatever, where the person isn't just like gonna snap, have a heart attack, right?
Right. And again, I mean, these are the type of consequences that eventually people, they realize they're part of the business. I'm into fitness training. I mean, like I said, I detest steroids, but there's people who are actually talking about that idea of steroids and how complicated it is to do it in a healthy manner. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that this is the right thing. What I'm saying is that it may be worth exploring the idea that, you know, since we have such a hard time finding the line, maybe we shouldn't look for a line. We just let, you know, chips fall where they may, and or at least consider exploring that idea, and then see people see where we land, essentially with that topic. What do people do about this? I'm sure there's going to be some health issues. I'm sure there's going to be some deaths, and then people realize that there's certain risks. And sometimes the way we're advancing in a lot of areas of life is by tinkering and by trying things out and seeing that some ideas are actually terrible. And perhaps by allowing steroids, people realize how terrible they are, and now they consciously try to stay away from them, rather than, like I said, I mean, be involved with a sketchy doctor that tries to conceal certain facts that you know, make them untraceable, excuse me, in their bodies, and potentially induce them with other toxins as well.
Yeah. So now we've had a 10-minute talk on steroids in baseball. I think we can tie this into the current poker situation regarding RTA, which stands for real-time assistance.
Real-time assistance. Yeah, because again, I mean, I asked the question on Twitter, and I think it's very relevant here. The question is, would you allow RTA assistance online if you were you? And I'll pass the question to you. Maybe again, we can do the good old, what do you think the response was, which is not very difficult to guess.
Yeah, I would say not a lot of people publicly advocating for using RTA or allowing it while you play it. I guess because it is Philosophical Friday, right? Like, the first question that I have or would like to flesh out is like, what is RTA, right? Like, what is considered real-time assistance? Because, you know, a HUD is technically real-time assistance, right? It is giving you feedback in real time, and it is assisting you. So like, we have HUDs, you know, there are push fold charts, there are pre-flop charts. All of these things are assisting people in real time.
Exactly. And again, it's one of those things, where do we draw the line? It's one of those questions that it can go anywhere from, you know, a very simple starting hand chart, all the way to, you know, we go to HUDs, all the way to essentially solvers that work real time. And what is your view on that? Should RTAs, you know, for starters, I mean, to make the question simpler, let's say, should we draw a line on what can and cannot be used? Let me start there in terms of RTAs.
And yes,
I think we should. Okay.
I think we should draw a line, and I don't think it should be allowed.
Okay. Because I'm actually on the other side of things. It's not like the steroids where nobody knows, and I'm like, you know, maybe we should explore it and see. But in terms of RTAs, I actually think they're actually a good thing to let them in the community. And the reason for that is, for example, I'll speak from personal experience. I will never play in a high stakes game online if RTAs are not allowed. And the reason that is very simple. I don't think necessarily, no matter what people will tell me, I don't necessarily, I don't have any guarantees that the site is secure, right? I would never worry about being rigged, which is, right, the thing that can be a little bit of an oxymoron. But who can guarantee that the person that I'm playing against is not out there cheating? And I have actually a personal story of this. You know, like, I've been playing a lot of heads up, and I was playing against a particular account that I was down, and me being competitive, I wanted to actually be able to beat them. So at first I thought it was variance. Then eventually, you know, I thought, you know, I was worse. So I was like, you know, maybe they're better than me, you know, like maybe I have to look into my game. And until eventually I had a very long sample, more than 20,000 hands, where I realized that basically the person was botting. So it will take a long time to be able to know whether or not a certain account is, and I certainly do not want to wait for 10,000 hands to realize if somebody is RTAing. So the reason why I'm saying, and I'm sort of like, a very heavy favorite of allowing RTAs is because, again, it cannot be enforced, but also it provides the regulars a tool to basically defend themselves. So regular versus regular, again, nobody's going to make any money. Only the website is going to make any money. And against the recreational players, you don't need the RTAs anyway. If you play with an RTA, you're doing it wrong against the recreational player. So this is sort of like my hot take for the day, and we can go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the danger is that obviously if it's provided universally, then it needs to be provided by some sort of platform, some sort of operator, right? In which case, like, everybody has access to it, and then poker just isn't poker anymore. It's just like clicking the button that the software is telling me to click, and that to me, like, kind of ruins the spirit of the game and makes it like less a game of human beings and more a game of software and robots, which to me is just like, I mean, it's tragic, and it's not a game that like I'm super interested in.
I'm with you 100%. And actually, to me, it feels more like, okay, is this going to be a game of robots that we can make money, or is it going to be a game of robots that actually they're going to take advantage of us? Because I do agree with you. I mean, this is sort of like the direction where it's headed. And incidentally, chess.com, they actually have the same issue, because engines are far more superior than human beings. And chess.com is at the at the risk of losing a lot of customers, because people do not want to play against the machine. There's a lot of people who are just for fun, I'm gonna put the engine, and then instead of you playing me, you're going to be playing the engine. So fortunately for them, the statistical analysis is far more clear when somebody's using a real-time assistance in chess, that you can actually catch it within a few games. So you don't need a very large sample to know that people are playing perfectly, because we know what perfect is in chess. It's actually very, very deterministic and doesn't have a lot of noise like poker does. So, and chess.com is hammering all of those people because it has an incentive. I sort of silently hope that would be the result by allowing RTAs, right? By allowing RTAs, maybe, websites will realize that potentially they will lose customers, although I'm not sure if that would be the case, because like I said, I don't see money changing hands in any different way. Again, reg versus reg is still going to be a losing battle for both due to reg, and then reg versus recreational. If you want to use RTA, you leave money on the table, up to you. But if you don't use RTA, then the recreational player again is going to have the same experience. So I think that actually the websites may decide to go in a specific different direction. But let me be specific. If we do not allow RTAs, which I very much see the point of the argument, right? I mean, it feels, we're letting a virus into our games, and I sort of get it. How can a player like myself, like a professional poker player, how can I be guaranteed that I'm not going to be cheated at the highest stakes?
Well, that's kind of the interesting part of it, right? Is that like, as long as I've been playing poker online, I have known that this was part of the deal, right? When you sit down, you understand that like there's incentive here for people to cheat. Therefore, there will be some people who cheat. And I mean, I do want to talk about one thing regarding RTA and its pervasiveness, right? What I find, what I think is probably the major fear of players at large is that they're in every game, right? Some form of RTA is like at every single online poker table. And one thing that I would say is like, the person who's actually using the real-time assistance needs to have some level of poker sophistication, because, well, for a variety of reasons. But number one, if like dude down the road from me who's never seen poker in his life is like, oh, here we go, I'm going to download this software, I'm going to play in this site, and I'm going to crush it, right? Firstly, they still have to deal with like the risk element of it that I think is understated, and that like, yeah, you can show an inexperienced poker player that like you should get it in here with ace king for $1,000. However, actually pulling the trigger and getting it in and going on like a 25 buy-in downswing while you're using the RTA and like losing $25,000, you still feel it, right? You might be clicking the right buttons. You're still going to go in a downswing and you're still going to feel the downside, right? So I think that's one natural deterrent to like unsophisticated players using RTA. And as you said, I think, again, it's more to minimize the edge and reg versus reg battles than to maximally exploit recreational players. So, yeah, I don't think that there's going to be a time where it's just like everybody's using it, or like one player at every single stake is using it, or multiple players at every single stake are using it. I just don't really see that as happening. And yeah, there's just, I guess we need to talk about deterrence, right? Like, and how to deter this type of behavior. Number one, the biggest deterrent would be, and I've spoken about this on the pod before, but some sort of criminal penalty. You go to jail, right? You do not collect $200. You go directly to jail. And then, you're a felon or whatever it is for the rest of your life, right? So I think that's the major deterrent, right? That would be the ultimate one, where there's a set of guidelines that say, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, these are the consequences to theft, getting caught, etc. Right? Personal liability, another big part of this, right? Like putting someone who's accrued millions of dollars effectively out of business and sending them to jail. That would be the number one deterrent. I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe ever. Probably not in my lifetime, right? So the second thing,
maybe, sorry to interrupt you, but maybe if poker ever gets regulated in a proper way and becomes part of the rest of society, instead of just being like a gray, sort of like borderline shady area, maybe that can happen at some point.
Maybe. Do people get arrested when they are caught like cheating in a casino?
Yes.
They do?
Yes.
They go to jail?
Yes. Because it's considered, again, I'm not a lawyer. This is considered some sort of a form of a theft. Now, specifically, the reason why I'm a little bit hesitant here is because there's certain gray areas. Like, for instance, with blackjack, there was a huge legal case where people, the casinos were trying to say, hey, they're cheating from us, and the blackjack players were saying, we're just using our brains, right? If you're using a specific device, then that's considered, the smoking gun, so to speak, and you can actually get penalties for that. Like, you have to pay fees and things like that. Once again, not a lawyer, but that's my understanding of it.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe, right? Well, I guess we'd have to wait and see, right? I don't know how the investigative process would have to work and all of that. But the second major deterrent would be that you can't play poker, right? You get caught, there's undeniable proof of wrongdoing, and you're effectively fired from your job, right? Which is where, blacklisting would effectively come in, which is quite a major deterrent, right?
Absolutely.
For professional poker players, like the way that we ply our trade and make money is through playing poker. And if you lose the ability to do that, right? Like, let's say your handed mob gets scrubbed, you can't buy in. There's a coalition of card rooms that say, we don't want your service. Across, the United States, you get on the list, you can't buy in, you can't play these tournaments, you can't log on and play on the various major poker platforms here. I mean, there's always going to be a way to like get in action underground. I think we can just pretty much say that that's 100% certain. However, I do think there are things that could be done that make the incentives of cheating not worth it, which would be the idea, right? Because like right now, same as in baseball in the 90s, the incentives were to cheat because there was no deterrent, right? But when people stopped getting voted in the Hall of Fame, when they started getting suspended for a year and then 5 years, and they really hammered down, there's much less cases of steroid use in baseball. In the same way, like that could happen in poker as well, which would be the idea behind a blacklist. And there's a lot of different elements of said list that I think are worthy of discussion. For instance, time of penalty for X penalty, right? Like, should it be lifetime? If you're 21 years old, like the extent of the cheating, right? Like, what is the extent of using RTA. I mean, all of these, like how do you prove undeniably that someone has been abusing the system and is effectively stealing money from players? That's a major part of it, because it's quite terrifying, the thought of just some powers that be in an ivory tower saying, oh, player X, Y, or Z, you're no longer allowed to play, right? So the whole process of governing the system would have to be well thought out and well executed. And yeah, I think it's even coming up with such a system is quite challenging, and a lot more challenging than just allowing RTA. Like
Absolutely.
your suggestion.
Here's the thing, to your point, right? I mean, you're taking the Platonic view, you're being Plato, right? I mean, this is something that has been tried before, and it is a very honorable way to think about things. The other side is the Diogenes sort of like approach. I mean, you're taking the top-down approach, where we're basically trying to think this through and intelligently try to figure it out in a very holistic way. And if actually that works, it's the best way to do things. Now, in terms of practicality, somebody like Diogenes will ask two questions. And these questions would be, number one, how do we prove that somebody cheated? Which is a very big if. Like, what if that person has, again, a very sophisticated software, which is similar to baseball? What if they have like a really nice hiding tracing mechanisms for whatever toxins they induce into the bodies? And the question number two, even if somehow there is some proof, or independently of whether there is a proof or not, how do we enforce those rules? Which is, I guess, these two things are a little bit related,
right?
And I would even ask a third question: if we live in a world where, let's say, for the sake of the argument, these things are unenforceable or untraceable, what do we do in that case, even temporarily? What do we do in a situation where? And again, you don't have to take my premise for this, right? I mean, this is a non-sequitur. Yes.
What's your opinion on what we should do?
Personally, like specifically for RTAs, because again, I've been, and you too, like it's, you and I have been in the poker world long enough to know that, there's no sort of hope in sight for poker players to change, right? I mean, as long as there's financial incentive, people are going to cheat. So my approach to problems like that, especially when it comes to online, is all bets are off. Basically, you go ahead and you do whatever the hell you want to do, and everybody knows about it, right? You want to go ahead, you want to multi-counting, go for it. You want to RTA, go for it. And it will become like a crazy thing where basically everybody has access to everything. And it will, what I'm hoping it will happen, it will actually bring the house down. And then people will realize that, maybe we need to have incentives like chess.com to do things better. Because the issue is, by creating the false narrative, oh, you know what, we do have security, come to our website, but then knowing about all of the cheating going on the site and do nothing about it, because again, you don't want to hurt your reputation, you do poker players a disservice. Let people fight back. Let people who want to play honestly fight back, use their own RTAs, have the situation again, because again, what I'm thinking about is that the recreational players are not going to get hurt anyway. The recreational players are going to lose, variance aside. I mean, no RTA is gonna protect from variance, right? So the recreational players playing the recreational player strategy, they're going to lose whether they're playing against an exploitative strategy or an RTA type of strategy.
What I think is missing from your side of the argument, though, Duncan, is the image of online poker when all these things are just like in your face, right, from the recreational player side, right? Like I think the image of poker, I don't know if it would recover from such an experiment.
No, this is very good. I agree with you 100%. And to be fair, I would argue that we're not doing very well in the marketing department. When people hear of online poker, they don't exactly think of the most prestigious, industry in the world.
Yeah, I don't know, right? Like, so I guess the loudest voices seem to be the ones on social media, but I don't know if that's the actual pulse of the poker world at large, because as I'm reminded when I go to a live event, right, the poker community itself is so big. Not everyone is as immersed in it. Not everybody who's listening to this podcast right now, when you go on Twitter, everything is poker, right? Like for
Correct.
me, it's all poker all the time. Everybody that I follow, all the tweets I like
Sorry, before
Twitter
we get
knows.
sidetracked, I was referring to the non-poker community, what they think about the poker community.
Yeah,
That's what I meant. Yeah.
right. And I'm not sure, right? So I don't know how Joe Blow, who sees poker on World Poker Tour and signs up to play on Ignition, actually feels about online poker, right? I'm not sure collectively if they think that everybody's cheating or that it's a scam or that it's rigged or they just want to play some poker, right? Like I don't really know their opinions, and I think it's kind of impossible to know their opinions because for the most part, I think they're silent. Now, I do think it's, like we can't be silent as a community as these scandals unveil themselves. And even before the scandals unveil themselves, I think that, there should be some kind of system in place to allow folks to blow the whistle, to submit incriminating information somehow. I'm not exactly sure, again, how that would go down or how that would work, but like the system that we have in place right now is just not, it's not existent really. It just doesn't really exist, right? It's like, oh, well, you get caught cheating or there's these heavy allegations and like your life doesn't change at all. You still like go down and play against the people that you've been wrecking this face to face, right? It's like, it's kind of silly.
And one question we can ask, however, is, are there going to be scandals if everything is allowed, within, of course, the letter of the
scandal law? If everything's allowed, how could there be a scandal, Duncan?
Exactly.
I mean, but what is everything, right? Like collusion,
right? Collusion, sure, yeah. If they want to collude, I mean, let them collude. And if the website actually has a way to stop collusion, obviously I don't condone collusion, right? I hate collusion. I wouldn't want to be in the middle of it. But what I'm trying to say is that instead of pretending that everything is peachy and there's security and people can actually catch, the cheaters, let it be whatever it is that it may be. And then from there, we start fixing, because again, if that ends up, drying up specific games and then the websites are not going to have any revenue, then they're going to try to change it exactly the same way that chess.com for survival reasons. And keep in mind, chess is not played for money. But they were trying to say, nobody liked to play against engines, right? Say,
I'm sure chess.com is not making a ton of revenue either, right? They're not going to blow up their business model by doing such a thing. Whereas, online poker is generating, billions and billions of dollars. These are billion-dollar companies that would basically be risking all that revenue.
For sure, but at least they would be honest with their player base instead of pretending there's security. I hear that word all the time. I'm actually not convinced. I never believe a single word. I'm not. You don't have to be conspiratorial. All you have to do is just be in the past 20 years and see all the scandals of ghosting, multi-accounting, even people who today we revere, right? I mean, there is a lot of shady people doing a lot of shady stuff. And to be honest with you, there's also a lot of good people do a lot of shady stuff just because nobody tells them otherwise. So they're just exploring things and they do all that stuff. So I'm very, very skeptical. Like I said, I mean, I had my personal experience. I was waiting. I know better to just say that the website is rigged, right? So I know better to say that just because I had a losing streak of 5,000 hands, something is wrong. So I had to wait. I had to wait for 10,000 hands, 20,000 hands.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I was like, okay, the first thing I will say, I'm inferior to that player because, that's more likely than being cheated. Let's face it. But then you realize that for every one person that gets caught, there's probably 10 people who don't or who will never get caught. And then we have to deal with all of that. So
right. And this is the problem. Well, like, so the incentives of the poker operator are such that they're not even super incentivized to like get rid of bots, right? Like, exactly. I mean, because bots generate rake and put in lots of volume, right? They can because they have no emotions and they've got no brain. So they just click buttons and click buttons and click buttons and generate shitloads of rake, right? So like you can see how the incentives for the operators are already compromised just right there, where it's like, yeah, you guys have like 1,000 bots on your platform, but those bots make so much money for you that like, is it worth it to like be proactive and kick them off. And I mean, depending on the operator and, you know, what their values are, for the most part, I would say their values and what their incentive is to make money. Also, another sort of, I guess, issue is, I'm not going to say issue because I understand it from a business perspective, but in all of the hubbub, someone who had, you know, worked in Star Security basically responded in a thread. I can't remember his name, but he responded in a thread about how, you know, Stars had invested something like $50 million into security over these past, like, however many years. And that, you know, because they've made this investment, they're not going to share the ways that they police their games with other platforms because they feel that gives them a competitive advantage, right? So I understand this from the business standpoint, right? They invested their resources. It gives them a competitive advantage, and maybe people play on Stars because they feel safer than a separate website. But what it also says at the same exact time is that they don't care about the games being fair, right? Like that's not their that's not their MO. They really, they don't care, because if they did care, it would be open source and they would share it with everyone. So, you know, I think that's like something that everybody has to bear in mind is like, the incentives of the operator are not such that kicking cheaters off their platform is a major priority, because you're basically spending money so that less people play on your platform, right? Which is, yeah, just it's a tough pill to swallow. It's a tough road to go down if you're running a poker website.
Absolutely. I would agree with that 100%. And to be fair, you know, part of what we're talking about is a little bit rhetorical. You know, I don't think that at any point everything is it goes, but it's a nice, I think, philosophical anchor. Do this thought experiment and see what would happen, because I do feel that at the, I mean, nobody knows what would actually happen unless it happens. But one possible outcome out of all this is that the recreational players, who are really the real customers out of all of this, I don't think anything is going to change to them, because in the end of the day, the recreational players are basically going to a casino and they're gambling their money. So whether they're gambling it to a machine, or they're gambling it to a human, or they're gambling it to a human that uses a machine, in the end of the day, it doesn't make much difference. If they are actually willing to sit in front of a screen instead of going to a casino, perhaps, you know, what I'm saying is that this wouldn't surprise me if that was the outcome, right? I mean, we wouldn't know unless we actually run the experiment, but it would at least make sense that as long as they gamble, it doesn't necessarily matter where they gamble their money to.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just like all the pros and grievous violation of privacy to have like a 360-degree camera on,
like chess,
in their environment at all times while they play, and somebody can observe everything that's going circularly around them and everything that's on their screen, just to make sure, right?
They do that in high-end chess tournaments, by the way. They do that. The double camera. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. At the super high level of chess, you don't need to make many great moves. You only need one move to get like an incremental advantage, and then the grandmaster will take it from there. And similarly, you can do that in poker too. There's a very
see how gross it is, right? Like, there's not even a ton of money in chess, and people are still cheating, right? To what end? I don't understand that part of it. It's like, what's the point? Like, you're looking for like some kind of status, prestige. I mean, in poker, the incentives are obvious in that, you know, there's money here, right? Like, there's money to be made directly from it. But chess, I don't understand. Could you enlighten me, Duncan? What's the point?
I don't know if I can enlighten you, but I'm pretty sure our ancestors had something to say about that stuff. We usually say there is a saying that basically said, you know, like a lot of people hated money, but nobody hated glory. You know, so I guess what, you know, our ancestors were, or our predecessors, I should say, are basically trying to tell us at this point is that people need to feel important in one way or another. And if that prestige or that status is, you know, there are right and wrong ways to do things, but sometimes lying to ourselves and trying to be in a spot which is not earned. And again, I mean, the best liars are usually the people who actually lie to themselves first, incidentally. So sometimes people can get, I remember I was I was watching an interview about some of these scandals, and they interviewed Matt Damon, and they asked him something, and then he said, "It happens in the movie industry all the time. People want to be famous," and I asked them all the time, "Do you want to be famous for what exactly?" And then there's no answer, just famous. People want to be famous for the sake of being famous. And when I say people, I mean we're all people, like, I mean, I'm not just in a self-righteous kind of like way I'm excluding myself out of this.
Sure.
But we had that conversation before, Brad, right? I mean, like, what's the point if you cheated, you haven't won? Like, that's not real. Like, I feel exactly the same way. Like, if you get something without actually trying, no matter how many people you confuse, and no matter how many people you tell that to, you cannot convince yourself. That's the real issue. So, but what I'm saying is that sometimes perhaps it is at least good to give also the good people some of the tools, and then see what happens, at least at a philosophical level. It will never happen at the practical level, but hopefully that answers a little bit. So hopefully our ancestors can answer that question, because I certainly can't.
So taking a step forward, a little bit out of the philosophical realm, sure. Just your snap gut opinion on the consequences, poker blacklisting. What are your thoughts? How do you think that should be? Like, what do you think that system should look like?
Right. I'm a very big fan of crowdsourcing of sorts. And by crowdsourcing, I mean, I'm a big fan of rating systems. Like when it comes to movies, I'm a big fan of public forums. So I think the best way in situations like this is the public outcry. So the poker community, by and large, has been very astute with issues, and has also been very accurate. I'm not saying there hasn't been misaccusations and things like that, but typically speaking, because there's a lot of people who are good people, and the majority of people are actually good people, and they mean good. Even the people who do bad things, sometimes they're good people. I'm excluding the psychopaths, because there's always going to be evil in the world. But for the most part, when something happens, the majority tends to sort of like rise those ideas to the top. So for me, any form of blacklisting has to be in the form of public outcries, because I don't think any particular...
And what are the consequences after public outcry?
Well, I mean, let's split it. So there's some tangible consequences. And for me, I wouldn't do anything that cannot be enforced, which may seem arbitrary. Like, for instance, I've mentioned that before. Some people may not want to play with Howard Lederer and, Chris Ferguson, or, other people like Russ Hamilton, or they may not want to play with Jose Guillermo Macedo, or they don't want to play with Michael Postle at the poker table, Now, this is very difficult to be enforced, because what are we going to say to the casinos?
How come you have an ID that says Mike Postle, right? And they say,
allegedly,
sorry,
I don't know. That's what I hear. People don't want to play. I don't know. I have no. But my point is, though, that I tend to be a little bit cautious when it comes to top-down enforcements, because again, where do we draw the line? And how can this be exploited? So how does a casino, which is an entity, decide who does and who doesn't play at the poker tables? But I do think that humans at large, and poker players at large, should actually express their opinions. And if they say, you know what, I don't want to play with these guys, I think it would be to the casino's best interest to say, you know what, if the entire table doesn't want you here, you know what, sir, you're not welcome here, because the customers are not welcoming you. Some sort of like crowd outsourcing these kind of ideas, and ostracizing of people that we think that they may have broken the rule. What are your thoughts about blacklisting?
Well, I mean, I guess the second part is like, I think poker is comprised of a lot of folks who are naturally introverted and non-confrontational, and so the practical implementation of just shunning someone, I don't know how much that would take root. Like, I don't think that would I mean, there's instances right now, right, where people are being heavily accused of cheating folks out of millions and millions of dollars, and still just kind of are there, right? They just like sit down at the table and buy in, and they play and act like everything's all hunky-dory and totally normal. So like that already happens, and those folks haven't been shunned, right? There haven't been like, people boycotting or not playing in a specific tournament because a said player is in the tournament. But I mean, in the case of like Stones and Mike Postle, that whole situation, right? I mean, the casino effectively did nothing,
Right.
right? Like they did nothing to, they didn't weigh in on it. They didn't ban anybody. They didn't investigate. I mean, they said they investigated, but I think like, I can speak for everyone when I say that they probably didn't investigate. They hired like, my cat to go and run an investigation into the whole scheme. And, the cat ran around and rubbed its head on some tables and meowed and said, everything's cool. Nothing happened. So like when there's not incentive for a casino to do something, I mean, that's another thing too, right? Like how do you, one thing that I could imagine happening at a casino is like you blacklist somebody. What if they also are like a major degen and go and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or lose millions of dollars in the pit, right? Well, the casino probably doesn't really care if they're cheating people in poker, right? They just don't. I mean, so are they going to exile that person from the casino, or is it just specifically the card room? I mean, you have to imagine it's just a card room, in which case, like, is a casino, again, are they incentivized to keep people out? Are they incentivized to have less people play in tournaments and less people play in cash games? They're not. So like, there's this natural clash of incentives here that make this whole situation exceptionally difficult to navigate.
Absolutely. And you're actually making a very good point, because in the end of the day, it comes back to that business. And we have to deal with the reality of the issue that the casinos are running businesses. So part of the reason why I'm suggesting outsourcing is because that, I mean, crowd outsourcing. And by that, I'm using metaphorically, I mean, let, the public sort of like decide what they feel about those individuals, is because eventually, the casino is going to have to make a cost benefit analysis. And they're going to say, okay, so that person, person X who cheated makes me Y amount of money. But at the same time, when he's around, a lot of people are feeling uncomfortable. There's a lot of, fights that break in. Cost benefit analysis. Do I want to keep this person in or not? And in the end of the day, without saying that there is a specific rule, because again, where do we draw the line? The rules can be very difficult. They can make a judgment based on what people feel, because I feel that it is very, very difficult to do this top-down analysis. Again, in an ideal world, in a world that, Plato, of all people, we're talking about Plato, we're talking about some of the smartest people that ever lived on this planet. In an ideal world where, the right people are in the right positions, perhaps we can actually have a top-down approach that has specific, clear rules. And to be fair, part of our modern society has achieved that. There is a part of our society which is top down. It's not a perfect society, but it's much better than it was like 1,000 years ago. So this is not a fool's errand. It's worth discussing those topics, and those ideas are great. But at the same time, I feel we live in an environment where information flows very quickly. So casinos can actually listen, can incorporate that information, and consumers can push in specific directions. At least that's my thoughts. Yeah.
No, those are all great thoughts. And it's one way to target the incentives that I think makes sense on a practical level, because a lot of things are, impractical. I mean, the idea of like a blacklist is like great in theory, right? And then when it comes down to like practically implementing the measures and like asking ourselves, what does undeniable proof even mean? And what is the punishment? And like, how do we scale these things? And basically you're a governing body at that point. And like, who's elected? Who's the judge, jury, and executioner, right? Is it some kind of council? Is everything investigated independently? And don't get me wrong, I actually think that like poker has a lot of raw intelligence, like as a community.
Absolutely.
And I think by and large, most folks who are in the community want the best for poker and don't want to destroy everything. Like I think that like the thing that we see and that stands out is a bunch of bad actors.
Absolutely.
Who also like kind of a bad acting black hole suck in other people to kind of turn them into minions and do their bidding for them, right? And that stands out. Just it's way more obvious than the folks who aren't doing such a thing, right? And yeah, it's just it's a tough situation. And I think like for now, on this episode of Philosophical Friday. I think we can put a pin in the discussion. Are there any questions that or any threads that you feel we should resolve before we call it a day?
No, I think you did an excellent job, both summarizing and approaching both sides. So it's a very tense situation between the top down and the bottom up approach. Ideally, we would be able to find a system which will accommodate the majority of people. That would be a top-down approach, and hopefully there's also some bottom-up tinkering that can happen at the same time to calibrate and actually help us gauge what this top-down approach would be by trying different things, which is part of the reason. And I want to make that clear, because we say things like let everything be, and some people are saying, oh, Duncan doesn't care about the poker community, or he doesn't care about online poker.
For the record, you're the one saying let everything be. I just want to
absolutely no, I'm taking full responsibility, absolutely. So my point here is that I very much do care, and I think that sometimes tinkerings of that type can actually uncover issues with our approaches, with our top-down approaches, and then we can actually get a better system at the end. So I do feel that by experimenting with different approaches, and that has actually happened in the past. Certain websites allowed for HUDs, otherwise other websites banned them, and then we saw the difference. And by and large, there wasn't much difference in terms of, that's my understanding anyway, in profitability. So people learn by tinkering, and I think that would be an interesting thing to try in a modern era where RTAs are everywhere and technology actually can allow for people to do this and go undercover. And incidentally, one more thing that I want to say is that typically people who do things repeatedly are the ones who get caught, right? We have no idea how many people, at the high stakes, they might have used, RTAs in very key moments, and then nobody knows any better because it's one moment or two moments. So who knows,
Right.
So.
The scariest thing about the ultimate bet scandal back in the day with the super user and the whole Russ Hamilton thing is like, well, just if I were to have that power, I would have ran it 20 big blinds per 100 and nobody would have ever known. Like, you know what I mean? Like if somebody Absolutely. Who is like actually thinking about how it looks and like, because the poker community found that, not ultimate bet, right? Because again, the incentives are like not in alignment for ultimate bet to publicize that somebody was super using. So they denied it for a long time. And the poker community is the one that like proved mathematically this person is cheating, right? Because, this one account is like winning tournaments all the time, right? They just seem to be like making all the best decisions at every single spot. Well, yeah, obviously, that's very obvious. And it actually is quite shameful to me that Russ Hamilton has won a World Series of Poker, because like, oh my God, like how dumb do you have to be to do such a thing in that way? But what's terrifying, like, yeah, I'm criticizing Russ Hamilton's ability to cheat right now.
Cool. Yeah, no, but that's good. You see, you have to think like a cheater to be able to catch one, and that is important.
And what's terrifying is that who's to say that someone smart didn't have a super user account? They could have, right? There's no, how would you know if they were doing it in an intelligent way? That's what's terrifying at the end of the day, is that, yeah, there could have been more super users on Ultimate Bet. There could have been super users on other platforms. And if they're smart about it, you would never know the difference. And that's what's, that to me is what's scariest of all with these scandals. And to kind of, wrap up here, should something be done moving forward one way or the other as it relates to these issues? Because there's a lot of talk. I don't know of a ton of action that I've seen, or at least organized, I guess. What's interesting to me too is like, it's not like this is something like new, right? It's not like, right. Oh wow, this is a problem in poker and everybody's like gaining wind of it, like all spontaneously at the same time. Like people know what's going on, especially anybody that's in the security side of the industry, anybody that's in the high stakes side, they have an idea of what's been going on. So it's not like this moment of spontaneous realization. It's more so creating a system that deals with this in an intelligent way, where there's actual consequences is a difficult thing to pull off, right? That's the major problem. And like, I've thought about this key problem many hours in my life. How do we do a better job? And it's a hard problem.
It's a very hard problem.
As somebody that loves solving hard problems, this one has, it's got me stumped in this way,
Absolutely.
right? Where there's not an easy solution. But
me too, incidentally, and that's the reason why I'm making that suggestion, right? I mean, that's like, if I would like to see something, it would be experimentation on what happens if we push the boundaries on what is allowed. Like, what would happen if, let's say, step by step, we allow more and more software to infiltrate the online world? What would you like to see, Brad? What would be something that you would like to see, like from a practical standpoint, or
I'm
from
not
a
sure.
theoretical standpoint, even?
Well, I'm not sure. I have to think about this more. I have to think about like how do you attack the incentives in a way that makes sense, where it's effectively not a system of like, oh, we find out about stuff because a horse becomes disgruntled or guilty, right? Like we're banking on guilty consciences to come forward to blow the whistle. I mean, that to me is like not a super great system. So I mean, I don't know. I have to think about it because I don't know that I have a better one like right off the top of my head, because it's just such a gigantic problem to solve. But I guess to answer, my question is, does something need to be done? Yes, something needs to be done. I don't know how exactly it's going to be done. I don't know who's going to do it. But I do think that something needs to be done.
And I can't help it because it is Philosophical Friday. I just want to point out something to the listener. Sometimes the best answer is to not give an answer if you don't have one ready. It's okay to say that a problem is deep and difficult. It actually shows appreciation of the actual problem instead of just actually proposing a solution that could actually be bad. So what you did right there, just for the listener, I think it's an incredibly important answer, and it can apply to poker too. It has nothing to do with today's conversation, but the idea that, I'm not sure yet, I'm still investigating, I'm thinking about it, and that's a sign of actually seriously thinking about a problem instead of just trying to say, I'm trying to patch it up, and I'm just going to throw out a solution there because I want to be a talking head and I want to just say something. So I think you do show that you have thought about a problem like this at a very deep level. I just want to make that comment.
Well, I appreciate that, Duncan. And I guess with that said, I appreciate that a lot. And we'll wrap up today's conversation. You kind of have to be able to say, I don't know, as a poker player, I think, or to reach the higher levels of the game. You have to be comfortable saying, you know what, I don't know the answer here. I say this to my students and my wolves all the time, right? They're like, what should I do? I'm like, I'm not really sure. Let's investigate it. Let's try to learn. Because it's a big game and this problem is a big problem. And there are a lot of big problems in the world where, yeah, the answer is not obvious and it's requires lots of thought. And maybe me personally would never be able to find the solution, right? Maybe it takes a team of people or somebody more intelligent, more insightful, more creative than I to actually solve it. But, I hope those people are thinking about it as much as I have. And I hope that the powers that be are looking at this problem and giving it the weight that it deserves, because it's an important one to move past.
Excellent. Very well said.